Welcome everyone. This is a very exciting new edition of our Virtual Brain Minds and Machines summer course for 2020. And I'm very excited to be here together with the two other course co-directors, Tomaso Poggio, from whom you will hear very soon, as well as Boris Katz, who's going to be also giving a talk. So very soon I will give the podium or the microphone to Tomaso Poggio, who's going to be giving a historical account of AI and neuroscience, a personal account of how the Center for Brains, Minds and Machines was created, and the path towards the future. And I want to emphasize that one of the reasons why we have this summer course here is that we really want to start a new field right at the intersection of cognitive science, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. And that's why here at the end of this line are your discoveries. We see all of you as the next generation, and we really are looking forward to seeing all your major accomplishments and putting your seminal work and landmarks on this timeline. So now I'd like to introduce again Tomaso Poggio, who's one of the course directors. He's also the director of BMM and one of the fathers of AI and neuroscience, one of the seminal figures in computational neuroscience. And without further ado, I'd like to give him the microphone so that he can give us his own history of BMM and his own history of the field and his personal journey through artificial intelligence and neuroscience. So welcome, Tommy.
Thank you. So welcome to everybody. I'm going to tell you briefly about the center. We're organizing this summer school, as you heard, for the first time virtually online, which is a very interesting experiment in itself to see how much we can scale it up in terms of number of people by going virtually. And the center itself started in 2013, is a science and technology center, among the largest of NSF. It's about $50 million funding from NSF over 10 years. It's multi-institutional, multidisciplinary, and it consists of a number of researchers across different institutions and departments like computer science, neuroscience, and cognitive science. Its focus is on the science and engineering of intelligence, not only artificial intelligence in order to build intelligence machines, but especially the study of intelligence in order to understand how our brain works, with the secondary mission of then being able to replicate intelligence in machines. And so in a sense, our basic bet, our basic philosophy, our basic vision is that it's similar to DeepMind, because after all, Demis Hassabis, who started DeepMind, was a postdoc of mine. So it's similar to DeepMind in the belief that the problem of intelligence is the greatest problem in science today. It's one of the great problems in science, like the origin of the universe and the origin of life, I think is the greatest of all. And so we are agree on that. The slight difference is that we want to understand how the brain works in order to make intelligent machines, or as an after effect to make intelligent machines. But the first priority is understanding how the brain makes the mind. The key problem is how the brain works, how the brain creates the mind. And if we understand that, then we can make intelligent machines. This would be a proof that we really have the understanding. And of course, would be very important and interesting in its own, to having machines that make ourselves help us to be more intelligent. The reason why we think that's a good way to make intelligent machines, to understand how the brain works, the reason is that if you look at recent success stories in AI, and I'm a little bit biased, I choose these two, DeepMind and Mobileye. These are David Sassabis and Amnon Shashua. They happen to be postdocs of mine, ex-postdocs of mine. That's not the reason I chose them. I chose them because DeepMind is arguably the most advanced research places, at least in the corporate world, in the area of artificial intelligence. DeepMind has almost 1,000 people based in London, part of Google. And Mobileye has been a very successful AI company, created in Jerusalem around the year 2000, was acquired by IBM a couple of years ago, by Intel a couple of years ago, for around $15 billion. And both of them are really basing their success on two strengths of algorithm, reinforcement learning and deep learning. And now both of them come from neuroscience. That's one reason I'm saying that it's a good bet to bet in neuroscience if you want to do AI. Reinforcement learning comes from the research of Donald Hebb, and it's not the first neurophysiologist to pave the ground for research on reinforcement learning. There are several other ones, but the origin is there. You could say neuroscience and cognitive science. The deep learning is the original idea about a hierarchical architecture of neurons, in the specific case here in visual cortex, came from a conjecture of David Huber and Thorsten Wiesel based on their work in the 60s, recording from visual cortex in the monkey and the cat at Harvard. And the architectures of deep networks today is essentially the same as what they postulated in their paper of having a hierarchy of neurons in different layers with more and more complex features and properties from simple cells to complex cells, what at the time they called hyper-complex cells, and so on. So, our vision in the summer school is to focus on the combination of neuroscience, cognitive science, and engineering. And as I said, the reason is that as this historical glimpse shows, I think it's likely that several of the next breakthrough in artificial intelligence or machine learning are likely to come from neuroscience and engineering, the combination of neuroscience and engineering. So let me finish with this brief introduction about the center and its vision and the vision of the summer course and why we designed it around the neuroscience and machine learning and cognitive science. I want now to shift to a different gear and give you some observations about the history of computational neuroscience and machine learning through my personal eyes. This will be part of the last 50 years. I'll tell you a few things about the year between this 1970 and the beginning of the Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines. I started my work as a researcher in a Max Planck Institute in Tübingen, Germany, not far from Stuttgart, not far from where Daimler is, producing Mercedes and Porsches. And the director of the institute was Werner Reichert. Werner was a physicist originally. He has two advisors. One was Max von Laue, who got a Nobel Prize in physics. The other one was Ruska, who is shown in the center here. And he got also a Nobel Prize in the 80s for his work on the electron microscope. So he started this institute to study the visual system of the fly, and he called to the institute to work with him three other directors, Carl Goetz, Valentin Breitenberg, and Kuno Kirchfeld. Valentin Breitenberg is quite well known for a delightful book called Vehicles. And the idea was to understand a system, a nervous system, which was simple, but not too simple, the visual system of the fly. The fly is about 1 million neurons, which puts it about halfway on a logarithmic scale between us and unicellular organisms. We have about 10 to the 12 neurons, and unicellular organisms have, of course, one cell. So it's a beautiful system with beautiful eyes. The eyes of the fly are essentially 3,000 little eyes, each one with its own lens, called ommatidia, each containing 7 photoreceptors. What we did in the work there, this was work in the group of Werner Reichert, one of the 4 groups in the institute, was a series of studies at 3 different levels in trying to understanding some cognitive behavior, let's put it this way, of the fly. And so the first level is trying to define and model the behavior which includes chasing of other flies, which is part of the sexual behavior of a fly, and fixation of objects, which is part of survival for trying to find a place where to land. And then at another level was looking at the algorithms that were needed to do this. For instance, measuring motion or measuring position of contrasted object in order to be able to fixate them. Computing relative motion between parts of the image and the rest in order to detect, for instance, flying objects against a stationary background. And the last level was biophysics of computation. How do you implement in neurons and synapses this algorithm? I'll give you an example and then come back to this idea of understanding a complex system at different levels. So the study of the behavior, this is kind of doing psychophysics on the fly, was putting the fly in a cylinder suspended from a system that measured the torque. So the fly was flying as if the fly was free, but in fact was fixed. But the compensator there was measuring how the fly would like to turn and ideally how to move up and down and so on. And then there was a simulation of the dynamics of flight, a kind of virtual reality at the time. And then according to this simulation, the environment was moved around the fly, as if the fly were to move around the environment. And so this was a way to measure very precisely all the quantities involved and creating a virtual reality system for the fly. And from this kind of experiments, you could measure how the fly was going to behave with respect to tracking a flying object or not flying objects, depending on the various variables involved. And we came up with a model of this, which was a stochastic differential equation, which included the dynamics of flight, which is just how the wings interact with the air and with the inertia and the mass of the flight, and then what the flight does, which is on the right-hand side here, which was producing a search noise, which is roughly random, roughly Gaussian to a first approximation, and then producing a torque around the vertical axis, which depended on, for a single object, a single target, was depending in a nonlinear way on the angle between the direction of flight of the fly and the position of the target on the eye of the fly. This is this error angle psi here. And then another term that was measuring the motion of the object of the image of the object on the eye of the fly. And so this gives us a quantitative theory. It was giving us a probability distribution of where the fly was expected to go. And based on this, we could actually, from this theory, which was derived from measurements to this virtual reality environment, we could actually predict some of the free flight behavior of the fly. And we could verify this by filming the flies chasing each other in a box, a three-dimensional box, filming them and from 2 points of view and obtaining X, Y, and Z of each fly as a function of time. And so you have here stereo pairs of a chase between two flies. You have the left stereo image on the left, the right one on the right, and the top plot is a chase between two flies, and the bottom one is a chase in which the trajectory of the first fly is given, it's the same as the one above, but the trajectory of the chasing flight is actually produced by our model. And you can see it's not exactly the same as what we have measured, but quite similar. And it's a prediction just based on the trajectory of the chasing, the first flight. So it was pretty good in terms of modeling the behavior. It was also the same theory was able to predict a few cognitive aspects of the flies. For instance, the fly has a behavior which is somewhat similar to what we'd expect from the Müller-Lyer illusion. So when confronted with the pattern above, you see a distribution of fixation, which is the first histogram below. And when you have the other figure of the Müller-Lyer illusion, you see a behavior which is quite a bit different, kind of indicating a perception that is similar to ours, of the segment being longer in the second case, despite the fact that it has the similar length. And also the ability to see what we call subjective contours, which it's a kind of illusion. You can see in B, and the fly also happens to fixate the subjective contours as predicted by our models. Of course, I did not explain all the details of the models to you, but just to give you an idea. So in a sense, at this level, we were able to provide a theory a little bit similar to, Bayesian theories of cognition in humans. The theory does not speak about neurons. It makes some assumptions about the kind of computation that go on and are able to predict and model the behavior quite successfully. But then the question is, if you go back to what I'd shown you here, I told you that this term psi dot is measuring the velocity of the image of the first flight on the eye, the image of the first fly on the tracking fly, on the eye of the tracking fly. And this is the velocity. Who's measuring this? The phenomenological theory assumes it's available. And here it is essentially giving you a position of the target on the eye of the chasing fly. So who is computing this? How is this? So the phenomenological part of the theory up here assume that some bodies, some boxes, some modules do that. And the second level asks, how do these modules do this? How do you compute motion? How do you compute the relative motion so that you need in order to detect an object moving against the background, which is itself moving because you're looking at it while you're moving. And so at this level, the basic rules of how motion can be perceived, for instance, whether a pattern moves from the left to the right in front of two photoreceptors, 1 and 2, or moves from the right to the left. How do you do that? And this work had been done by Werner Reichert and Bernd Heisenstein in work that is famous. And they came up with a model which was a correlation model. You have delays, you multiply a signal from receptor 1 by a delayed signal from receptor 2, and you do the symmetric opposite thing on the receptor 2, and you add and subtract these two outputs. And this gives you a way to detect in which way a pattern moves in front of these two photoreceptors and describe exactly what beetles and flies do. So this was the algorithm. It's actually, these correlation models turn out to be completely equivalent to the so-called energy models that were devised later by Ted Ederson and Bergen to describe how motion cells work in primate cortex. And this found also applications in engineering, in particular to stabilize motion in early video cameras in the 80s. We also looked not only at the algorithm for motion, I said was all, but the work, how you can detect motion of, say, a piece of these random patterns against itself. This is kind of figure ground discrimination, very good psychophysics also for humans. If a little piece of this texture pattern moves in front of the rest, you can see it very well. If stops moving, there is no more relative motion, it will disappear on the background. And so we looked at that and we came up with Werner and Klaus Hausen with an algorithm that is shown here in terms of a neural network that can do this, and can be described as lateral inhibition between motion detectors. And it can do that very well. It can do that very similar in terms of its properties to how flies do it. A lot of experiment to substantiate this claim. And we know in the meantime which neurons are involved in the optical lobes of the fly. Some of the neurons have been recorded from, and their properties characterized. And so we have a pretty good handle on this algorithm for motion and motion, relative motion in the fly. But again, there is another level you can go deeper into, because again, you can ask in algorithms like this one, what is, okay, I'm assuming here there is a multiplication, but how is multiplication done by neurons and synapses? And what are really the biophysical properties, which synapses are involved, which transmitters and ionic channels? And so at this level, I did work with two people mostly. One was Vincent Torre, who is now in Trieste. The other one is Christoph Koch, who is in Seattle at the Allen Institute. And Christoph, by the way, was the advisor of Gabriel. And Christoph was also my first graduate student. And so what we did is what we call biophysics of computation. And Christoph pushed that much further. There is a book by him about this, how neurons and synapses can do elementary computation, such as multiplications. In the case of multiplication and particular motion detection, the model we came up with Vincent Torre was based on a nonlinear effect that inhibitory conduction changes can have. This is assuming a passive membrane in the neurons, but equilibrium ions such that the inhibitory conductances can effectively shunt the effect of an excitatory input. And so our model is a model of multiplication, of division, of something a bit similar to an AND-NOT gate. One of the input essentially vetoing the effect of the excitatory one. And these effects, as I said, are similar to multiplication and to division, are nonlinear, and explain how motion detection could be done. It's still unclear whether this is the mechanism used by the fly. It's still unclear whether this is the mechanism used in the vertebrate retina, although there is good evidence that is at least involved in determining directional selectivity in neurons in the retina. Okay, let me go on saying that at the same time I was doing this, I started to work with David Marr, and we developed a neural network, would be a recurrent neural network, to solve the problem of stereopsis. This is quite well known, but I want just to mention David, who with his book Vision, which was published posthumously, he died of leukemia much too early, had a big impact in the field of computational neuroscience. And this is David and me and Francis Crick in about 78, I think, in the desert behind La Jolla, behind San Diego. The part I want to stress here before I finish is that one of the important point in the book was this claim that we should understand, study and try to understand a complex system like a brain at different levels. And levels like computation, algorithms, biophysics. And these are the levels I told you about in the example of the fly. You can make similar argument for the study of the human brain. And this is, I invite you to do this over the next 2 weeks about the talks you're listening to. An important point is that in that work, this is David Marr made it famous, this argument, but the argument came from a joint paper that we had before, and in part from something that Werner Reichert believed well before I met David Marr. In our paper, we stressed the fact that these levels are separate and independent. You can understand, say, PowerPoint without knowing anything about the transistor and the logical gate that are working in our computer. And you can understand at a very fine level your transistor and logical gate and know nothing about the software that is running on your computer. So in an engineered system, these levels are quite separate, independent, and understanding a computer really means understanding all of them, each one, as I said, almost separate from the other. In the brain, we suspect that there are different levels, but they are much more connected than in our engineered system, which is why it's important to know and study all of them at the same time. Now, I was going to follow this with the rest of the trajectory, but this will take at least another half an hour. And so I'll leave it for another opportunity, maybe another summer school. This will be the time I spent at MIT from 81 to now. And this is a picture, by the way, of neuroscience at the time. You can see some interesting people. There was Francis Crick was here, and Gabriel was here. Jerry Edelman, a Nobel Prize in immunology, and then working a lot in neuroscience is here. And Don Glaser, Nobel Prize in physics is here. Eric Kandel here. Torsten Wieser here. David Hubel. Chuck Stevens. Rodolfo Lines. This is me. And so a lot of John Dowling, Snyder, Rakic, Werner Reichert. This is Frank Schmidt, who started the Department of Biology at MIT. So with this, let me finish this short excursus. It has been shorter than I would have thought, but at least I gave you some food for thoughts in the sense of these levels of understanding, which I think is an interesting paradigm to keep in mind across the next 2 weeks of the school. Thank you.